There is an old dream in human history that returns in new costume every few generations. The dream is that our tools will save us from being human, not assist us, not extend us, not relieve some of the more idiotic inconveniences of existence. Save us from being human, from limitation, from slowness, from boredom, from solitude, from friction, from mortality, from dependence on one another, from the necessity of building character rather than installing upgrades. And in our age, this dream has found its priesthood in the tech oligarch and its cathedral in the billion-dollar platform. Now let us begin by avoiding the usual stupidity. This is not an argument against technology as such. That would be childish. No one sane wishes to return to a world without antibiotics, clean water systems, anesthesia, libraries, or the ability to send information across great distances without hiring a horse. The issue is not tools. The issue is who controls them, to what ends, and what kind of creature they are turning us into. That is the real question. Because the modern tech oligarch does not merely sell products. He reorganizes reality. He alters the texture of attention, speech, memory, desire, work, friendship, status, courtship, politics, childhood, leisure, and even the private shape of thought. He does not simply enter the market. He enters the nervous system. And what is he doing there? Not ennobling it, I assure you. The first thing to understand is that the tech oligarch is almost never what he claims to be. He presents himself as visionary, liberator, builder, world improver, friction reducer, innovator, connector, optimizer of human possibility. He speaks in the language of empowerment while constructing dependencies. He speaks of freedom while building systems of surveillance. He speaks of connection while presiding over mass loneliness. He speaks of information while producing confusion. He speaks of progress while degrading capacities without which civilized life becomes impossible. In other words, he is a familiar type, a man who privatizes power while universalizing the rhetoric of benevolence. This is not new. It is merely digitized. What is new is scale. Never before have so few people had such intimate power over the daily mental environment of so many. The old tyrants could censor books, control broadcasts, intimidate institutions, imprison dissidents. These people do something in some ways subtler and more invasive. They shape the conditions under which billions attend, compare, speak, desire, and react. They do not only govern what is said, they govern what is seen, what is amplified, what is rewarded, what is rendered addictive, and what becomes almost impossible to avoid. That is a form of sovereignty, whether or not anyone has the courage to call it that. Now, why does this matter? Because humanity is not destroyed only by famine, plague, war, or explicit tyranny. It can also be destroyed by deformation, by becoming less capable of the things that make a human life recognizably human. Sustained attention, interior silence, memory, friendship, not mediated by display, courtship, not reduced to interface, speech not flattened into performance, leisure not consumed by compulsion, thought not constantly interrupted, judgment not outsourced to metrics, and moral life not shaped by algorithmic incentives. The tech oligarch does not need to kill these things openly. He only needs to make their opposites easier, faster, cheaper, and more habit-forming. That is the method. Consider attention which is the beginning of nearly everything worth having. Love requires attention. Friendship requires attention. Study requires attention. Prayer requires attention. Art requires attention. Political sanity requires attention. Even ordinary decency, the ability to notice another person as more than background furniture, requires attention. And what has the technology empire built as its central business model? The monetization of interrupted attention, a system in which the human mind is treated as extractable terrain, broken into units of engagement, constantly prodded, measured, diverted, provoked, and fed back to itself in more addictive form. This is not a side effect. It is the business. You are not, in that ecosystem, the customer in any serious sense. You are the mind substance. Your distraction is the revenue stream. One should not understate the moral ugliness of this. An entire civilization now increasingly rests on the deliberate destruction of concentration, and we call this innovation. Then there is language. Humanity depends on language not merely for communication, but for truthfulness. If language becomes degraded, manipulated, compulsively reactive, flattened into slogans and speed, then thought itself begins to decay. The platforms owned and shaped by these men reward not careful speech, but rapid legibility. Not seriousness, but virality. Not proportion, but outrage. Not the difficult labor of saying what is true, but the profitable performance of saying what will spread. The result is that millions now speak in ways subtly shaped by systems designed not to cultivate depth, but to maximize circulation. And circulation is not the same thing as meaning. A civilization that can no longer tell the difference begins to rot. Now consider the self. The old tyrannies usually wanted obedience. The new digital empire wants exposure. It wants the self turned outward, quantified, compared, displayed, optimized, and made available for continuous social measurement. Human beings, who once had at least the possibility of interior development sheltered from total public scrutiny, are now trained from youth to become brands of themselves. One must be visible, legible, reactive, updatable, performative, always present, always available, always slightly sellable. This has done catastrophic things to human dignity, because dignity depends in part on inwardness, on the existence of a zone of selfhood not wholly arranged for market or audience. The tech order attacks that zone relentlessly. It encourages people to convert identity into content, feeling into display, grief into signaling, beauty into self-advertisement, sexuality into marketplace, and thought into performance. Then it tells them they are expressing themselves. They are not expressing themselves. They are dissolving themselves into an economic medium. This is one of the darkest achievements of the age, the conversion of personality into extractable asset. And from here, the consequences spread outward. Courtship becomes gamified. Friendship becomes intermittent audience maintenance. Politics becomes theatrical tribalism. News becomes nervous system warfare. Childhood becomes early branding plus surveillance. Leisure becomes compulsive recovery from the very system that made one exhausted. One can see, if one is honest, that this is not a healthy civilization merely going through an awkward phase of adjustment. It is a civilization being systematically rewired by people whose fortunes depend on making higher human capacities less stable and lower impulses more profitable. That is why the tech oligarch is not merely another rich man. He is a curator of conditions. He helps determine what sort of environment the human soul now has to survive in. And here one must say something impolite. These men are not, as a class, answerable to the scale of the power they wield. They are often adolescent in imagination, messianic in rhetoric, libertarian when regulation threatens them, and paternalistic when the public threatens their business model, all while controlling infrastructures through which social reality is increasingly mediated. This is a very dangerous mixture. Immense power, weak metaphysics, thin anthropology, and a quasi-religious belief that technical capacity justifies social redesign. Why is that so dangerous? Because when people with extraordinary resources and mediocre moral seriousness acquire the tools to reshape how millions think, speak, buy, desire, and coordinate, they do not merely build products. They become accidental legislators of human possibility. And accidental legislators are often the most dangerous kind, because they can always say they did not mean it. No tyrant in history has had a more useful alibi than we were just trying to improve the user experience. Now, one might object that ordinary people choose these technologies freely. No one is forced to use them. But freedom in the formal sense is not the whole matter. Human beings may choose what deforms them. In fact, they do it all the time. The question is whether systems are deliberately engineered to exploit weakness, amplify dependency, and colonize habits before mature judgment has a chance to defend itself. And of course they are. That is why these platforms study compulsion so intensely. That is why they refine interfaces for stickiness. That is why they reward outrage, vanity, and comparison. That is why they keep people in loops of partial satisfaction. A person at rest is less profitable than a person agitated. So the system trains agitation. This has political effects too, and ugly ones. A populace that cannot attend, cannot deliberate. A populace addicted to reaction cannot reason. A populace trained to confuse visibility with truth becomes infinitely manipulable, and a populace whose private life has been dissolved into display becomes easier to shame, herd, profile, and govern. The tech empires did not invent propaganda, tribalism, envy, or panic, but they have industrialized their transmission and lowered the cost of producing them. They have built engines that turn human weakness into social architecture. And one should be very careful before calling that progress. But perhaps the deepest injury is spiritual, because humanity is not only a matter of information exchange and consumer convenience. It is a matter of depth, of inwardness, of reverence, of the capacity to be alone without panic, to think without interruption, to love without performance, to work without constant validation, to encounter beauty without immediately converting it into shareable material. The tech order steadily erodes these capacities. It makes solitude harder, silence rarer, memory weaker, attention thinner, desire more mechanical, identity more public, judgment more outsourced. And once these capacities erode far enough, people become easier to manage, not because they are coerced, but because they are diminished. That is the truly sinister form of domination, not chains, but reduction. Reduction of the person to profile, reduction of thought to reaction, reduction of relation to interface, reduction of freedom to menu choice inside systems built by others. In such a world, humanity is not destroyed in one spectacular act. It is thinned out, flattened, distracted, commercialized, rendered compatible with environments optimized for extraction rather than flourishing. And then, because the process is wrapped in convenience, people thank their rulers for making life easier. One should refuse this servility. To say that tech oligarchs and their companies are destroying humanity is not to say they are villains in a comic book, stroking white cats while plotting doom. It is worse than that. It is to say that they are powerful enough to do immense civilizational damage while remaining sincere in their self-congratulation. They think they are solving problems, and in some narrow sense they are. They are very good at reducing friction. Unfortunately, many of the frictions they reduce are precisely the conditions under which humanity deepens. Waiting, thinking, remembering, talking face to face, being bored, being alone, learning patience, developing taste, forming judgment, sustaining attention. A life with less friction is not automatically a better life. Often it is only a shallower one. So what is to be done? Certainly not theatrical primitivism. One does not resist the empire by smashing one's phone with a hammer and living on lentils in a cave, though the cave would have certain advantages. The answer is more difficult and less cinematic. One must recover sovereignty. Sovereignty over attention, over language, over appetite, over time, over the boundary between private life and the market, over what may enter the mind and what must be refused. One must become harder to profile, harder to addict, harder to provoke, harder to monetize. That is not mere lifestyle advice. It is civic defense. It is spiritual defense. It is, increasingly, defense of the human itself. Because if the age's most powerful men are building conditions under which distraction triumphs over thought, stimulation over contemplation, exposure over dignity, and interface over relation, then the refusal of those conditions is no longer quaint. It is an act of preservation. And preservation, at a certain point in history, becomes the most radical task of all.